Morning, booktube. It is, what time is it? It's almost 8 a.m. when I'm filming this. We're not going to have the most attractive look in this video because it's flippin' cold. You've probably heard across the news that much of the country is under single-digit temperatures right now. It was single digits very early this morning here, and then a few hours ago it bumped up to 11. According to my weather app, it says it is apparently bumped up to 20 now. Feels way colder than that, but can you all see real feel -4? I've never seen a real feel in the negative numbers on my phone before, but I can believe it this time. So that is why we look like this. I did get the animals fed, which was a little bit challenging because Finn, our lab, seems to pick the coldest days to go leisurely stroll about which area is going to be his morning constitutional. And I was just out there going, I don't care, just pick a spot, please, for the love of God. But yes, finally got all that taken care of, and since I'm kind of up and awake now, I figured I would go ahead and do this video that I meant to film yesterday, but battery died. So this is the next round of motivational. Today it's going to be MOCHA again, because again, early day, and not drinking alcohol this early, although the cold could help, but no, not going to start this early. So yes, just MOCHA again. We might make it back around to mojito someday. I do have them in the fridge, it just hasn't worked out for when I'm filming these things. But this video is going to be talking about money and the sort of struggle between status and surviving when it comes to money. So the first book, there's only going to be 2 books in this video. I know the last one ran a little bit long. I think that's the last one I have planned for a while. It has like a bunch of books. I think the rest of them from here on out only have like 1 or 2 or maybe 3 at the most. But for the most part, they'll just be like a couple. So the one I was going to start with today was The Status Seekers by Vance Packard. This is a old vintage copy. This was... was this originally written? I want to say this was originally written in the 50s, 59 it looks like, and then reprinted in the 60s. I'd had this book on my shelf for a while, and I remember getting it a long time ago because I get curious about oddball vintage history books just to see like how things have changed. This one talks about just this kind of countrywide span of a study he did on his own. I forget what his profession was other than being a writer. I forget if he was like a professor or something. I guess I'll have to look that up. He did this study on sort of economics and class structure and everything, and starting in the 50s, and spanned it across the country for the most part, but a large part of his study was done in areas of New York. And he looks at everything you can think of when it comes to money and status, and as far as being the status seekers, talking about why people strive for the things they do, what compels them to constantly push themselves for getting the material possessions, the status symbols. What makes a status symbol? How do we develop these ideas of status symbols? How does it vary between different neighborhoods, different suburbs, even different communities, ethnicities? How does it all differ and compare amongst all these sort of qualifications and structures within society? And it's funny because you would think that this being written back in the 50s, that this would just be completely dated and obsolete now, but in fact, while some of it does read a little bit dated, there are actually still plenty of points in here that you could still kind of nod your head to and be like, yeah, I do wonder about that, because there's still issues we run into. He gets into the way people sort of maybe unconsciously pit themselves against their neighbors or their coworkers. Not like aggressively where you actually get in a fight with them, but just like in their mind, you look at what your neighbor has, or you look at the promotion your coworker got, or maybe if you're a parent, maybe you compare the way, I don't know, like maybe the car you have compared to other parents at the school, the cars they have, the clothes their kids wear versus the clothes your kids wear. All these different areas of life that we are constantly in our head comparing to each other. And he looks at, why do we do that to ourselves? Why is it so damn important to us? The way this book breaks down, it's just a little thing when you first look at it, but there's so much packed into here. And it breaks down into 5 basic parts, essentially. Part 1 is going to talk to you about how status is generally developed, just as a whole, the idea of status, how we come about defining that. And within that part 1, he also talks about the reasons that people are likely to pursue it so strongly. Part 2 talks about the markers of status, the actual physical material things we put status symbol labels on, whether it's a particular job, a car, type of house, a neighborhood. And one of the things I thought was interesting is in that section he gets into the history of status symbols and how they've developed over the years as technology has grown, which is something I never really thought about before, but it's kind of a fun thought to think about. But he mentions how your status symbol will change as people as a society grow and develop and technology changes. So back in the day, it might have been like maybe your status symbol was a prime farm animal, or I don't know, just like quality linen or something like that. If you think even back to Roman times, you could always define people as far as their wealth by what their jewelry looked like and what kind of clothing or what kind of fabric their clothing was made out of. And then it progresses into, like I said, maybe the type of horses you have, or if you have horses at all. I know in some countries, if you have certain livestock like goats or buffalo, that gives you rank within a village or a community. So he says there are things like that, and then it can develop into, okay, well, if you have a certain kind of car, and one of the things he mentions is, if you think about it, people used to pursue the car, just having a car at all, and then it was the type of car, and then when cars in general became pretty affordable as a whole, you have your luxury cars that are harder for people to obtain, but in general it became a lot more accessible for pretty much everyone to have a car. And so at that point the status symbol changed to what type of house you lived in, what neighborhood you lived in, those kind of things. So I thought that was interesting. They talked about like the history and the progression of the status symbol itself. One of the other entertaining parts of section 2 I thought was funny is he gets into what he calls snob appeal, which is basically just when you have people that are so focused on entering into like getting their name on the rosters of elite clubs, basically, getting into country clubs, getting into exclusive bars, or just societies in general, why that's important to people and what it does to their mentality. Which, along with that, he also talks about like the constant one-upping of people, which even now is kind of funny to watch. One of the other things that he gets into that also kind of got me thinking, he gets into the different distinctions and sometimes barriers that people can run into when it comes to their ethnicity or who they decide to get involved with, the roadblocks they can run into that way. And then part 3 is sort of like a look at strains of status, what it can do to you mentally and physically, this drive to constantly be at the top of everything and be the envy of everyone. He gets into the problems we can develop, such as depression, anxiety, diabetes, hypertension. He also gets into just more intense mental illness, paranoias that can develop, that kind of thing. And also the effect it has on family relationships and friendships and even romantic relationships if you're constantly consumed with chasing something. Part 4 might seem a little bit dated as far as anything in the book, because it talks about trends of status. And there he looks at, he's writing this in the late 50s. He's looking at, given everything he's researched in the book so far, what it might mean for the 1960s going in. But if you're a history nerd, or if you've experienced the 1960s yourself, you might find it interesting, because you'll see that some of his predictions actually weren't that far off for the time. Part 5, the closing part, is where he gets into sort of the implications of status seeking as far as the future of the human race as a whole, which sounds kind of epic, but basically he's talking about what is this going to mean for our society as a whole, our human race as a whole, if we don't stop charging for these things and putting so much importance on material items and status and all that. But in between all that, there's a lot of interesting things in here. One of them being when he gets into the description of actually going to New York and studying all these different neighborhoods and boroughs and all that. And he studied everybody, every ethnicity he could observe, from whites to Jewish communities, Puerto Ricans, African Americans, everybody he could find, and just made notes on what he was observing between these communities. And I thought it was kind of interesting that he said that, a lot of times, even in you're thinking about the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of racial tension between the African American communities and the white communities across the country. But when he was doing this study, he found that while that's commonly in the news, what surprised him was there are actually similar racial tensions between what would be considered minority ethnic communities within themselves. Fights that didn't involve whites at all. He said he witnessed, black communities going against Puerto Rican communities, and Jewish communities going against Italian communities, and just all this back and forth, which I thought was interesting, because I didn't really think about that as far as status going. But I don't know, I found it thought-provoking to read that he discovered that. I don't know, you'd like to think that people would, if they're all striving for the same thing, that they would help each other out and help everybody get there. But I don't know, there was something about this book, reading it in today's times, that made me a little sad, because I'm like, in some respects, we haven't gotten very far. We all still want similar things, but we're not helping each other, it doesn't seem like. So this one was definitely thought-provoking, if you don't mind some of the dated stuff. But for being sort of like a economics-based, almost kind of like a history book, I don't know, I thought it was a good time. And there's a blurb on the back from Newsweek that says, "Fascinating view of contemporary pride and prejudice." So, it's definitely made me curious to see if I can find some of his other books and see how those turn out. The second book I had to talk about today was something a little bit more modern, but again, not too modern. It's still a little bit dated by now. But you've probably heard of this one. And that's Nickel and Dimed by Barbara Ehrenreich, I think it is. And oh boy, this one left me with mixed feelings. This was one of those books. It's a nonfiction. It's another one of those sort of economic studies. But the way the author went about her project here, it kind of rubbed me wrong, more than I expected in this book. But basically, this is, it's not really a well, I guess you could maybe qualify it as a memoir, but it's more like just a project she put herself through and then wrote a book about. But Barbara Ehrenreich has a PhD in biology, and I forget what her profession is other than, again, like I said with Vance Packard, I forget what the profession is other than writer. I know she's written a few other books in this sort of like sociology, economic type of genre, where she does these research projects. I know she has a few other books like that out, and in this one she talks about how, in the beginning of the book, she's describing how she's sitting down with her editor over this fancy lunch. She points out at the beginning of the book that she's sitting at a really nice posh restaurant with a $30 lunch, and I forget what triggers the conversation, but they get to talking about how problems of the world and how journalism isn't really being done the right way. And she kind of throws out the comment, somebody really ought to go back to like old journalism, get down in the trenches and really get to know the common man and report about their struggle. And her editor was like, well, why don't you do that? And she was like, what? No, not me. I don't want to do that. And these are, she's describing it herself. She admits that she was not keen to do this project in the beginning. And she gives him a million reasons why she doesn't want to do it. But he keeps pushing her, no, I think you should do it. I think you should try. And she eventually comes around to the idea, thinking that, you know what, I have a PhD. It's been a while since I've taken the scientist route. I think I'd like to try that again. Also, let me mention that when you read this book, she points out her PhD and her education a number of times. In case you were worried about forgetting that she has a PhD and she's highly educated, she's going to remind you again and again. So she goes on this project where she's going to try to study the working class, the lower class, the class that's living on a minimum wage and trying to make it work with welfare and assistance programs and things like that. And I had suspicions that this was going to go bad when she starts off telling the reader that for reasons of laziness, she was going to start her project, which she intended to span across the country, or at least the East Coast or so. She was going to start in the town closest to her own town. And I was like, great, we're starting on a foot of laziness. All right, cool. That's going to bode well for getting to know the working class. And I had a little bit of a personal investment in how this project was going to work out because I come from this world. Not her world, but the working class world. It's the only class I've ever known. I mean, you could maybe argue now that my husband and I are like maybe lower middle class at this point, but we've worked really, really hard and we've scrimped and saved and struggled just to have that much. But that's been like years in the making. But other than that, we have worked minimum wage jobs and have sometimes worked 2 or 3 jobs, just doing whatever we could to keep the lights on, the bills paid, and not be homeless. So yeah, I had a little bit of a personal investment in how and what she was going to find. And it just, from the very beginning, it just seemed like, you know, she agreed to do it, but she was going to drag her feet the whole way through. But as this goes, she takes these different jobs. I think she starts in, I want to say it was Key West, Florida, where she took the waitressing job. And then she also, I forget where it was, but she moves on to a different job. She only takes these jobs like part-time to get a few notes, and then she moves on to the next section. And then I think each job she does a different section in. There was one point where she, I don't know if it was still in Florida. There was one point where she takes a job as like a dishwasher in a nursing home and does that for a while. And then she goes to Maine, I think it is, and takes a job with a company that she describes as a competitor to the Mary Maid's cleaning service. But as much as a germaphobe as I have become as I get older, it made me, and as much as I've worked in hospitality and food service and housekeeping and all of that kind of stuff, it made me cringe when she said that this company put an emphasis more on the appearance of clean rather than actual disinfecting of anything for the sake of time for the client. It's like, well, that's gross. So she talks about working for them, and then I think it's in Minnesota, she actually does 2 jobs at once, because I think she wasn't expecting to get the other one quite so fast, but then she just agrees and says, okay, I'm going to do both of them. So she ends up working at a Menards, which we don't have here, but I have heard of them. She describes it as like a Home Depot type like place. And then she also gets a job at a Walmart at the same time. I think that covers all the jobs she takes on, if I remember right. And then each, like I said, each section gets a different discussion. Overall, I felt like it was big old missed opportunity. There was so much she could have dug out that I think because she went into this unwillingly, she just dismissed. Yes, she talks about how tired she is. She does get into her experiences of retail hell, which I did sympathize with her about, because I have worked those jobs and it is hell to be on your feet all day and work stock rooms and constantly move stock, and the whole myth of having like set lunches or even breaks, all those things that she just sort of expected and then was shocked when it didn't happen. Yeah, so I could sympathize with that, and I do not miss those days. No, I do not miss those days. But there are some things in here that just, they bothered me, because like one of the things she mentions is there are parts where she's talking about how it's almost like she's preaching about her frustration at the plight of ethnic communities and what they have to go through, and she feels for them and she wishes somebody would talk about their struggle, but then she doesn't talk about their struggle. Like, she doesn't actually spend that much time like actually meeting people from these communities she's trying to sound like she's campaigning for. She doesn't actually get their side of things. And in fact, she even points out in the book that she intentionally skipped over areas like New York and LA because her reasoning, this is one of the parts that angered me. Her reasoning being that she felt that most of the people that worked in those areas as far as minimum wage jobs were going to be minorities, and she, as what she describes as a white woman with a non-accented English was going to stick out and look desperate if she applied for those jobs. And I just felt something in me just curl up and like ignite into a flame, because I was thinking, I live in a nice quiet neighborhood now, but I was thinking back to when I lived closer to downtown and I lived by myself and I was trying to make ends meet. I lived and worked in some of those communities she's talking about. And yeah, I went for those jobs, even though it could be argued that I'm what she's describing, a white woman with at least mostly non-accented English. Sure, I can vibe into the California or Carolina tone back and forth sometimes, depending on who I'm around, but for the most part. But I applied for those jobs because I was desperate. I needed money because I had rent, I needed heat, I needed food in my house, and even applying for those jobs and even working those jobs, I was still desperately hanging on. A lot of those years, I was still looking straight at being a breath away from homelessness, even working 2 or 3 jobs at a time. I was just struggling to scrape together any dollar I could to hold on to those times. And for someone to come in and say, oh, that's going to make me look desperate. It's just like, that's the point. You think anybody wants to live in this class? You think we're all just chilling out here? Like, no, that's the whole point of being in this economic class. We're all struggling. I thought that was what she understood when she went into this. And then she's like, oh no, I mean, that's just, no, I'm not going that way. So, yeah, things like that, anyway. But what I will give her credit for is when she works at Walmart, that's when a lot of stuff that did resonate with me just started coming out. So that's where a lot of this is tagged. And oddly enough, it's the last job she takes on. And I forget, I think I want to say she almost walked out of the Walmart job because she didn't want to go through orientation, but then decided to just do it anyway, I guess. But I tagged a few things on here I thought I would mention that did stick out to me. One of the things is when she's talking about going through Walmart orientation, and they're talking about the different things that you have to remember as an employee, the rules about jewelry, and she mentions like they'll let you wear jeans on Fridays, but you have to pay for the privilege, which it wasn't Walmart, but I can't remember what it was now. I did work for a company that had that rule, that you could wear stuff on casual Fridays, but you had to, that might have been when I was working at Office Max, I think, years ago. I think we had a rule at the company that you could wear jeans on Fridays with your uniform, because normally you had to wear dress khakis all the time. But I think on Fridays you were allowed to wear jeans, but I think with them also you had to pay to do it. And I'm like, I'm not going to pay you to... But then she goes on about how they started a speech about time theft, which if any of you have worked at Walmart, you may have heard of this. I myself have never worked at Walmart, so I don't know. But she mentions them going into time theft, and she said, "This last one sends me drifting back off into a sci-fi direction. And as the time thieves headed back to the year 3420, loaded with weekends and days off looted from the 21st century." And then finally a question. The old guy who was being hired as a people greeter wanted to know, what is time theft? Answer, doing anything other than working during company time. Anything at all. Theft of our time is not, however, an issue. There are stretches amounting to many minutes where all 3 of our trainers would wander off, leaving us to sit there in silence or take the opportunity to squirm. Or our junior trainers would go through a section of the handbook, and then Roberta, returning from some other business, would go over the same section again. My eyelids droop and I consider walking out. I've seen time move more swiftly during 7-hour flight delays. In fact, I'm getting nostalgic for 7-hour flight delays. At least then you can read a book or get up and walk around or take a leak. It's just a personal thing of mine, but I don't know if it's like my grandma's etiquette training or something, but I still kind of cringe a little bit hearing a woman use the term take a leak. And I know it's the era of, equal opportunity and equal rights and all that. There's something to my ear that just doesn't sound right in my ear when a woman uses the term take a leak. But anyway, moving on. I thought that was a fair point, that you go on these job sites or take these jobs, and they're so adamant about you not wasting company time, but think about all the time sucks that happen when you as an employee have to wait around for the upper hands to get done whatever they're doing. I mean, it is kind of messed up that there's not an equal give and take with that. And then in that same time frame, she's talking about working at Menards. I thought this section was kind of funny, actually. So she starts talking about starting at Menards for the first time. And she said, I'm due at Menards at noon. At this point, although I have not formally accepted either job, I realize I am officially employed at both places, Walmart and Menards. Maybe I'll combine both jobs or just blow off Walmart and go for the better money at Menards. But Walmart, with its endless orientation, has alas already sunken its talons into me. People working more than one job may have to take sleep deprivation in stride, but I do not. I am shaky. My brain is fried like that egg in the partnership for a drug-free America commercial. How am I going to master the science of plumbing products when I can barely summon the concentration required to assemble a breakfast of peanut butter and toast? The world is coming at me in high contrast snapshots, deprived of narrative continuity. I call Menards and get Paul on the line to clear up what exactly my shift is supposed to be. Steve, or was it Walt, said noon till 11, but that would be 11 hours, right? That's another thing I cracked up at. You think you just getting 8 hours? Yes. Have you watched Office Space? Right, he said. You want to be full-time, don't you? And you're going to pay me $10 an hour. $10, Paul asked. Who told you 10? He'd have to check on that. That can't be right. Now thoroughly unnerved, I'm telling him I'm not working an 11-hour shift, not without time and a half after 8. I don't tell him about the generations of workers who fought and sometimes died for the 10-hour day and then the 8, although this is very much on my mind. I just tell him I'm going to set my knife, my vest, and my tape measure back. In the days that follow, I will try to rationalize this decision by telling myself that given Walmart's position as the nation's largest private employer, whatever I experience there will be at least of a grand social significance. But this is just a way of prettifying yet another dumb mistake, the one involving all that coffee. The embarrassing truth is that I'm just too exhausted to work, especially for 11 hours in a row. It's just... This is another thing that bugged me about this book. She waffles back and forth with this union topic. She dogs on them a lot, but especially in the last chapter of the book. But in the first chapter of the book, she mentions how her husband is a union organizer for the Teamsters. But then when it suits her purposes, she'll bring the union topic back and say, oh, well, people worked for us to have... It just bugged me. And also this whole, like, I'm not working without these conditions. And just like, she's missing the whole point of what people go through. A few pages later, she is talking about working at Walmart and her frustration with some of the things that are happening there. And she says, the only thing to do is to ask, why do we work here? Why do you stay? So when Isabel praises my work a second time, I take the opportunity to say I really appreciate her encouragement, but I can't afford to live on $7 an hour. And how does she do it? The answer is that she lives with her grown daughter, who also works, plus the fact that she's worked here for 2 years, during which her pay has shot up to $7.75 an hour. She cancels patients. It could happen to me. Melissa, who has taken the advantage of a working husband, says, well, it's a job. Yet she made twice as much when she was a waitress, but that place closed down, and at her age, she's never going to be hired at a high-tip place. I recognize the inertia, the unwillingness to start with the apps and the interviews and the drug tests again. She thinks she should give it a year. A year? I'm telling her I'm wondering whether I should give it another week. A few days later, something else happens to make kindly, sweet-natured Melissa mad. She gets banished to Bras, which is terra incognita for us. Huge banks of shelves bearing barely distinguishable bi-coned objects for a 3-hour stretch. I know how she feels because I was once sent over to work for a couple of hours in menswear where I wandered uselessly through the strange thickets of racks, numbed by the sameness of colors and styles. It's the difference between working and pretending to work. You push your cart for a few feet, pause significantly with items in hand, frown at the ambient racks, and then push on and repeat the process. I just don't like wasting their money, Melissa says when she's allowed back. I mean, they're paying me, and I just wasn't accomplishing anything over there. To me, this anger seems badly misaimed. What does she think, that the Walton family is living in some hidden room in the back of the store with the utmost frugality and likely to be ruined by $21 worth of wasted labor? I'm starting in on that theme when suddenly she dives behind the rack that separates the place where we're standing in the Jordache/no boundaries section from the faded glory region. Worried that I may have offended her somehow, I follow right behind her. Howard, she whispers, didn't you see him come by? We're not allowed to talk to each other, you know. The point is, our time is so cheap, they don't care if we waste it. I continued, aware even as I speak that this isn't true, otherwise why would they be constantly monitoring us for time theft? But I sputter on. That's what's so insulting. Of course, in this outburst of militance, I am completely not noticing the context. 2 women of mature years, 2 very hard-working women as it happens, dodging behind a clothing rack to avoid a 26-year-old management twerp. That's not even worth commenting on. Alyssa is another target for my crusade. When she returns to check yet again on that $7 polo, she finds a stain on it. What could she get off for that? I think 10%? I don't think I mentioned that part in the part I was reading, but earlier in this section it was talking about her coworker Alyssa was keeping an eye on this polo that she thought would be a good work shirt, and it's on clearance, but she's waiting for it to come down even more. So what could she get off for that? It was priced $7. I think 10%, and if you add in the 10% employee discount, we'd be down to $5.60. I'm trying to negotiate a 20% price reduction with the fitting room lady when, rotten luck, Howard shows up and announces there are no reductions and no employee discounts on clearance items. Those are the rules. Alyssa looks crushed, and I tell her, when Howard's out of sight, that there's something wrong when you're not paid enough to buy a Walmart shirt, a clearanced Walmart shirt with a stain on it. I hear you, she says, and admits Walmart isn't working for her either if the goal is to make a living. And then she goes in to talk about how she goes all Norma Ray. Finally, after months of all these things, she decides to find her inner Norma Ray for like a hot minute before she completely dumps the rest of this project. But there is a little footnote she included in here that I thought I would mention that I found interesting. It says, Walmart employees have sued the retail chain for unpaid overtime in 4 states. West Virginia, New Mexico, West Virginia, New Mexico, Oregon, and Colorado. The plaintiffs alleged that they were pressured to work overtime and that the company then erased the overtime hours from their time records. 2 of the West Virginia plaintiffs, who have been promoted to management positions before leaving Walmart, said that they had participated in altering time records to conceal overtime work. Shit. Instead of paying time and a half for overtime work, the company would reward workers with desired schedule changes, promotions, and other benefits, while workers who refused the unpaid overtime were threatened with write-ups, demotions, reduced work schedules, or docked pay. I guess when she was writing the book, she contacted people at Walmart, and she adds, in an email to me, Walmart spokesman William Wirtz stated that it is Walmart's policy to compensate its employees fairly for their work and to comply fully with all federal and state wage hour requirements, which of course they're gonna say that, but so Yeah, I think I got the most out of the Walmart section in there. If you're into like number crunching, she does do a section in here at the end that's just called evaluation, where she gives you a breakdown of all the expenditures in the different places she worked in. It was funny that at the beginning of the project, she was talking about how she insisted on having a car this whole time because she was not going to fight with bus schedules, and bus schedules weren't going to be interesting to write about, but that's the reality. You know, in my poorest times, I didn't have a car. I had to rely on the bus system downtown. You have to do to get to your job. But she said, you know, oh, because buses are gross and they're boring and I'm not going to do that, I'm going to have a car. But then when she hires all these rent-a-car places, when she gets the car, she's always bitching about how much the gas costs. I'm like, it's on you. You said you didn't want to ride the bus. You were too good for the bus. And there was another thing in here that I don't like talking about all the things that bug me in this book. Went into it with high hopes. I mean, because it had its period of being very well lauded, but it was, for me, it's going to be on that list of it had its moments, but one of the things I kind of shook my head over is she does a bit of ranting in here about employment drug testing, which I've gone through drug tests for nearly every job I've ever held. I've never thought anything about it because I figure an employer has a right to cover their ass. You know, think about it. If you had a company, you wouldn't want a liability. If you have machinery you're operating, my camera just turned off on me, and I think it just cut off all that stuff I just said. Man, I was on a roll. Anyway, I will try to remember what I was talking about. Yeah, so she was talking about the drug tests, and in so many words basically saying, you know, it was a product of the man trying to be up in our stuff, and did we really need this? And it was just, you know, infringement on rights and all that kind of thing. And I always felt like, you know, the reality is, if you think about it, I mean, imagine yourself as a business owner. You have machinery that you've put money into. You have employees that you're responsible for. You have clients or customers that you're liable for. You know, all these things you got to worry about. Is it really out of reason to put precautions in there and say, you know, I'm going to have you drug tested just so I know that I have a safe work environment. I can take one extra stress off my mind. So that's the way I've always looked at it. I've never faulted them for doing that, but man, she goes into a rant about that. And one of the things that I thought was bizarre is she mentions that in her jobs that she's never come across a drug addict, a thief, or a slacker. So she questions their existence. And my mind kind of went, wait, what? I don't know. I was thinking, you've seriously never, ever had a job or a company you worked for where you could point out somebody and say, you know, at the very least, they are not pulling their weight. Because I know damn near every job I've ever had, I could point out somebody on staff who could be trying just a little bit harder or a lot harder. When I worked at my graphic design job, there was one guy that came in as a temp that seriously every shift he would come in and sit down in one of those revolving chairs and do nothing but bitch about how his legs hurt the whole shift until somebody let him go. That was what he offered all day. And you know what really pissed me off? I found out that guy, even though he was a temp, because he was a man, I guess, I don't know. I later found out they paid him more than they paid me. And I was on my feet all damn day, running all over the company. Just pulling jobs for everybody. I don't know what happened, but yeah, I was like, I don't know that there's ever been a company I've worked for that I can at least point out a slacker. Okay, yeah, maybe there's not a drug addict or a thief, but there's always a slacker. So yeah, I'm like, I argue, you arguing their existence. There are things in here that I laughed over, and things that I cringed at, and things that in my mind had me saying, come on. And then she closes with this moment where she starts off saying something really great, and I'm like, oh, she finally gets it. In the last moment, she finally gets it. And then it doesn't work out that way. So the part I was talking about that had me cheering a little bit is she said, when someone works for less pay than she can live on, when, for example, she goes hungry so that you can eat cheaply and conveniently, when she has made a great sacrifice for you, she has made a gift of some part of her abilities, her health, or her life. The working poor, as they are approvingly termed, are in fact the major philanthropists of our society. They neglect their own children so that the children of others may be cared for. They live in substandard housing so that others' homes will be shiny and perfect. They endure privation so that inflation will be low and stock prices will be high. To be a member of the working poor is to be an anonymous donor, a nameless benefactor to everyone else. As Gail, one of my restaurant coworkers, put it, you just give and you give. So I was like, yes, she finally gets it. But then she closes with this. Someday, of course, I will make no prediction as to exactly when. They are bound to tire of getting so little in return and to demand to be paid what they're worth. There'll be a lot of anger when that day comes, and strikes and disruption. But the sky will not fall, and we will all be better off for it in the end. That's what she decided to close on. And it could just be me. Maybe because I was frustrated with the rest of the book. But when I read that closing statement, in my mind flashed this picture of her sitting there as like a grand lady at a fine dining table with all her high-class friends. And, you know, the term upstairs, downstairs people, you know, the downstairs people are the ones in the uniforms picking up all the crap off the table. I got this image of downstairs people standing behind the upstairs people listening to this conversation and hearing her say those words and saying, oh, we'll all be better for it. Saying, you know, it's just sort of like a surface level trying to relate, and you just, I think a lot of us have been there where you just hear somebody say something like that and you just know they're full of shit. They missed the point. So yeah, I struggled with this one, but to bring it back around to the motivational thing for the whole purpose of this video series, one thing I did take away from her experience, even through all my frustration, is watching her squirm, or reading about her squirming and being stressed out and tired, just working a little while in this type of life, in this economic class, and knowing that I was born into this. I don't know any other way to live so far in my life. I strive to know better. I strive to be in the affluent class one day. I'm not quite there yet, but seeing how much she struggled and thinking about how I haven't known any other life and I'm doing okay, it kind of made me feel a little bit proud of myself and kind of give me a little bit of pat on the back for my inner strength. Because clearly it's not a lifestyle for the weak. I mean, if you're born into it, it's not really any choice. I mean, you can rise above it, but as you're working your way up, you still got to experience it. So one of the big things I took away from this, thinking about what she was going through and what she was writing about, there were plenty of sections in there where I was thinking, you're not really connecting on the level you need to. You're not really getting it. And from that, I realized whatever happens in my life, you know, if I make it to that point where I feel financially affluent and I have the nice house and all of that, one thing that won't change is that I will never not be empathetic to people that live in the working class, because I'm here, I'm experiencing it, I've lived it my entire life. I know how hard it is. I know how thankless it is to try to make a living at this level. So no matter how much money I have, because I have worked my way up, I will always have empathy for anyone that is still on the path to working their way up, and I will do my damnedest to help anyone who is honestly trying to get there. So that is one thing that I am kind of proud of. So if you feel that struggle, if you feel like nothing is coming from this, maybe think on that. You are developing skills that not everybody is born into. When you're born into affluence, it is harder for you to pick up things like empathy and a real understanding of just pure hell and life struggle. You can kind of imagine it maybe, and you can do your best to have an open heart to people, but there's nothing like being in the trenches, man. So I mean, that's something to think on. You might not have the money, but you got some other types of gold in there, which I know sounds really cheesy and Hallmark, but think on it, and you might realize we're getting some good stuff out of this. So that's what I have for today. Thank you for watching, and we will talk soon. Bye, guys.